Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. And thank you all for coming out today for this talk, Essential Stories. I hope everybody here is safe and healthy and having a great Wednesday so far. Yeah, thank you all for coming in remotely for this webinar. My name is Amy Ellison. I'm the exhibition curator for the Los Altos History Museum. I'd also like to introduce Dianne Shen, who is our Museum Without Walls collection strategist. She will be my co-host today. We do not anticipate having any technical difficulties, but you can never be too careful. And for those of you who are in the area, Santa Clara County, I know we've been having a couple of power outages here lately. So in the unlikely event that I lose power or internet, Dianne is here to step in and keep things going. So thanks, Dianne. So this talk is in connection with a wonderful bilingual exhibition entitled In the Fields of the North and Los Campos del Norte, which features the work of David Bacon, who is one of our speakers today. And that exhibit is traveled by Exhibit Envoy and produced in partnership with the California Rural Legal Assistance, the Binational Front of Indigenous Organizations, and History San Jose. And we at the Los Altos History Museum were so excited to get to display this exhibition in our gallery. It was supposed to go up on March 19th. And we were about 3 days away from being able to put that exhibit up when the shelter-in-place order went into effect. So unfortunately, we were not able to open the physical exhibition, but with help from David and from Exhibit Envoy, we were able to create a new virtual version of the exhibit, which you will actually be able to see here during the talk today. And we also hope that after the talk, you'll head over to our website, losaltoshistory.org, and take some time to browse through the photos, read the stories on your own time at your own pace. So our talk today will go until about 1:30. Our speakers will have a conversation for about an hour, at which point we will switch over to a Q&A portion. So at any point throughout the talk, if you have any questions for either of our speakers, please feel free to write in your question using the Q&A feature. A lot of you are using the chat feature right now, so the Q&A feature is just a couple of icons over from that. So please go ahead and type in your question. And at the end of the talk, I will read out the questions for the speakers to answer. So again, there's no need to wait until the end of the talk. Just go ahead and type them in as they come to your mind, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk today. I also want to let everybody know that we are recording this webinar. So we're very excited to be able to make it available on our website. So people who were unable to attend live today can access the talk as well afterwards in the future. Okay, so without any further ado, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our two speakers today, David Bacon and Dr. Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez. Both David and Ignacio had been scheduled to give talks at the museum during the run of the exhibit. And so we are just really incredibly grateful to both of you for being flexible and being willing to adapt with us and pivot to this virtual format. So thank you both for doing this talk with us today. Dr. Ignacio Ornelas Rodriguez is a historian and currently a visiting scholar at the University of California, Berkeley. Ignacio's work and research focuses on California history, and in particular Chicano history and Chicano Latino studies and Latino politics. Much of his work is focused on archival research that documents Mexican and Mexican-American history. The history of Mexican labor in the United States necessarily includes the study of civil and voting rights and the generations of Mexicans who advocated for those rights. For the past 9 years, he has worked in the Department of Special Collections and University Archives at Stanford University, conducting research for archival acquisitions. Ignacio currently serves on the board of directors of the California Institute for Rural Studies. His areas of expertise include US and California history, political science, and Latino politics. David Bacon is a writer and photojournalist based in Oakland and Berkeley, California. His photographs and oral histories of contemporary migrant farm workers are featured in this exhibition, In the Fields of the North and Los Campos del Norte, a bilingual exhibition that gives viewers a reality check on the food they eat and the lives of the people who harvest it. For 20 years, David was a labor organizer for unions in which immigrant workers made up a large percentage of the membership. Those include the United Farm Workers, the United Electrical Workers, the International League of Garment Workers, the Molders Union, and others. Those experiences gave him a unique insight into changing conditions in the workforce, the impact of the global economy and migration, and how those factors influence the struggle for workers' rights. He has been a reporter and documentary photographer for 18 years, shooting for many national publications. He's exhibited his work nationally, as well as in Mexico, the UK, and Germany. And he's written several books and articles on issues of labor, immigration, and international politics, and received numerous awards for both his writing and photography. So we are thrilled to have you both with us today. Thank you so much again. And Ignacio, I think I'll hand it off to you.
Thank you, Amy. And thank you for organizing the webinar, but also all the work you put into the beautiful exhibit. And David, again, thank you for all your work. I wanted to start by asking David a little bit about his history. And if for those of you that don't know, David Bacon, his history as a social justice advocate goes back, well, many years. And I have a photograph that I wanted to share of David in his early years, where he's about 16 years old during the free speech movement at UC Berkeley. But David, I wanted to ask you really about your own personal and family history and how that shaped your social justice conscience.
Well, first, let me thank you, Nacho, for participating in this. And thank you, Amy and Dianne and the museum for this online exhibit. It's really very exciting to see the photographs and see that they're accessible even during this period of time when we are all trying to shelter in place. So thanks to all of you. Well, it's sort of embarrassing, but I'm glad that you did begin with this picture, Nacho. And that is me. I'm the skinny kid at the back with the glasses and his mouth open. We're singing. That's what the picture is a picture of. And this is it at night in December 1964 in Sproul Hall on the University of California campus. And we occupied Sproul Hall. Actually, about 900 students occupied Sproul Hall that night. And then a little bit later, as we kind of got down to the wee hours of the morning, they began to arrest us. And I think there were over 900 people who were arrested that morning. And I was among them. At 16, I was the youngest person arrested in Sproul Hall. And eventually there was a US Supreme Court decision in my case called In Re Bacon, which unfortunately the Supreme Court ruled that minors, which was the issue, were my rights as a minor violated? And the Supreme Court of that day decided that minors didn't have the same rights as adults did, and therefore mine were violated when I was arrested. At any rate, it was a very important experience in my life. I was in my, just about to graduate from high school and taking courses at the University of California at the same time. So I guess, what was I doing there? And how much, as you asked, Nacho, how much did it have to do with my family? My parents were radicals. They were leftists. My father was union president, a local president for a union that was called the United Office and Professional Workers of America, which was a white collar union in the CIO, which was sort of like, at that time, our country had two labor federations, one for industrial organizing and one for craft organizing. And the CIO was sort of the more radical one. And that union was the union for professional and clerical workers, and also for printers. And my father was a printer, which is why he became the local union president there. And as a result of that, and because it was a left-wing union, he got blacklisted. And so he couldn't get a job in New York City, which is where we were living and where I was born. And he came out here to California looking for work. And he found a job at the printing plant of the University of California in Berkeley, in the days when the university had a printing plant with presses and bookbinders and so forth. And he got a job there. And so then he went back to New York City and we packed our family up into an old an old Pontiac, and drove across the country and came out to Oakland, and that's where I grew up. So I grew up in Oakland. So I guess you would say that I grew up with a certain amount of labor awareness and also a certain understanding of politics, or at least, you know, it was something that was talked about all the time in my family. And when the student movement began, and so the free speech movement was the birth of the student movement of the 60s in this country. It was the first really big demonstration before Columbia, before, you know, the occupation of Sproul Hall then led to the occupation of buildings and campuses all across the country. And what it was that we were protesting actually is pretty relevant today, I think, because students at the university campus in Berkeley they had set up tables in Sproul Hall Plaza to recruit students to, first of all, to go to Mississippi and the Mississippi Summer Project and work for civil rights. And then after the summer was over, to recruit students to go to Oakland and to picket the Oakland Tribune over its hiring practices. And the Oakland Tribune was owned by a very conservative family, William Noland, who was a senator. And Bill Noland put some pressure on the university to stop the recruitment. He didn't like those picket lines. And so the police, so the university forbade students from recruiting on campus. And we, of course, protested that, saying this is our right, this is free speech. And the university said, no, if you keep on doing it, you're going to be punished. And so we went into Sproul Hall to protest that. And that's why it was called the free speech movement. That was where the name came from. So it was connected to the civil rights movement of that era. And when we think about the protests that are going on today over the murder of George Floyd and other African Americans by the police, I think that connects in a direct line all the way back to the civil rights movement in the South and to the protests over racism and discrimination here in the North, and the student movement that was born in protest of that. So that's sort of where it came from, and that's what I was doing there.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a very important time, obviously, in your history, but also in American history. And I've always been drawn to your work and been captivated by it because you're also a photographer who has always gotten very close to the individuals that you're photographing, or organizations, whether civil rights or labor organizations. And you're also obviously a writer. You've written extensively about the lives of farm workers, but other labor organizations throughout your career. And as we study your photographs, we also can see that you get very close to the individuals, but you also sit down and get to know them. I also wanted to ask you, because you were a labor organizer for some time, very successful labor organizer, and you spent some time with the United Farm Workers of America. And for people that don't know, the UFW was led at one point by Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez. And you spent some time with the United Farm Workers. I wanted to ask you about how your work as a labor organizer, specifically with the UFW, shaped your career.
Well, the UFW and the farm workers movement, it really changed my life completely. And I'm still living my life as a result of what happened to me and what the union did for me during that period of time. So I grew up in Oakland, and growing up in Oakland, I really didn't know anything about farm labor. I didn't know anything about rural California. I didn't know anything about Chicanos. I didn't speak Spanish, any of those things. And in the 1960s and the 1970s, The union, when it got organized with these big strikes in Delano and in the Central Valley, the Great Strike and the boycott, it drew in people all across the country, including in cities. And so I got drawn in originally. I was working as a printer myself at the time, and I got drawn in by the Farmworkers Boycott, because what would happen is that during the strikes, farm workers would leave the Central Valley and they would go to cities all across the country, and they would set up picket lines in front of Safeway, in front of stores, urging people not to buy grapes because grapes were on strike. And so as a kind of somebody with some union consciousness, and I was beginning to get active in unions. I joined my first union, the printers union at that time. And I began picketing to help the workers in front of the stores. And as a result of that, I began getting very interested in who these workers were. You know, I didn't really know anything about them. And eventually, I called up a friend of mine who was working in the legal office of the union in Oxnard and asked him if I could come and work there. And in order to learn, and plus I wanted to support the movement. I wanted to make my contribution. And so I went down to Oxnard and I began working for the union. And as it turned out, I wound up working for the union for a number of years. First as a legal assistant, and then when I learned enough Spanish to be of use, I began working as an organizer. So the union, it taught me a lot of things. First of all, it taught me Spanish. To the extent that I speak Spanish today, it's because workers and organizers taught me.
It's very good, by the way. You're fluent in Spanish. You're practically a native speaker.
Well, thank you for saying that, Nacho. Although I still have my problems with, you know, reading Don Quixote, I think would still be a challenge for me, but I can function, and that's due to the union. And the workers also taught me about the lives of rural people, what it's like to live as a farm worker. In fact, after I left the union, I worked for a year as a farm worker because I needed money, but I also wanted to understand. So I worked for Almaden Vineyards, you know, picking wine grapes, and I worked for Valley Packing Company in Watsonville, cutting cauliflower, just so that I could know as a worker. Because I had worked in other kinds of jobs before, in construction and as a cook and so forth, but I didn't really know what it was like, and so I wanted to understand. The union taught me about immigration. That was very important. I saw the first immigration raid that I witnessed in a grove of date palms in the Coachella Valley. And, you know, I'd been talking to these workers who were picking dates the evening before at the union office. And then I went out to the place where they were working the following day. And when I got there were the workers being loaded into this van by the Border Patrol to be deported. And I was just blown away by it, really. And it had a profound influence on me. It turned me into an immigrant rights activist, and I'm still an immigrant rights activist today, because I believe our immigration policies are so unjust and need to be changed. And that was my introduction to it, understanding what the migra meant to Mexicans and to working people here in this country. So it was kind of a, so one, I guess you would say, one job working for unions led to another. I was a union organizer for other unions in the years after I worked for the United Farm Workers. And then when I began wanting to do the work I do now as a writer and as a photographer, it was natural to want to document what I already had seen and what I already knew. And so I went back to Coachella. In fact, the first big documentary project that I worked on as a photographer was to document date palm workers. I went back to Coachella and went back to those groves of date palms and tried to show what it was like to work in the trees. And this was something for me because I hate heights, I even climbed up the ladder with one of the workers and took pictures of him working up at the top of that tree with the ground, 20 or 30 feet below. And that's kind of why I take the kinds of pictures I do, because you referred to this, Nacho, when you said, I try to get close.
Yeah.
And the whole reason for climbing up that ladder with that worker was so that I could be close to him while he was doing that job. I could show what his hands were doing. I could show what his face was doing. I could try to show what it felt like to be way up there in that tree with the ground so far below. So here I was with the camera trying to get close to him and focus on his face and focus on his hands and what the real kind of the nitty gritty was of the work that he was doing. And then in the background, you see that ground way down below. Or then some of the pictures show climbing the ladders, and you can see how tall the ladders are and how tall the trees are. It's to me important, and still is, to show work, because work is so important to us. And to show the work as it's experienced by the people who are doing it, what it means. Here you have a picture on the screen, for instance, of a young guy. He's from Nicaragua, from Esteli. It was very ironic and interesting to me because he had been a tobacco farmer in Esteli in Nicaragua. And then because of all of the economic changes caused by free trade and so forth, he was no longer able to make a living as a tobacco farmer in Nicaragua, and he came to the United States and wound up working as a farm worker for wages for a big tobacco company in North Carolina, which is where I took this picture. And what he's doing is he's showing us his hands, which are full of the juice of the tobacco, because what he's doing is he's breaking off the top of the tobacco plant so that it will grow big, broad leaves, which is what they use in tobacco production. And so in the process of doing that, he's getting the tobacco juice on his hands, and he's showing us his hands. And, sometimes context is important too. So I have captions that go with these photographs. And in the caption here, it talks a lot about the impact of tobacco juice, because what it does is it gives workers what is called green tobacco sickness. So you think about what it's like to smoke a cigarette. You smoke that first cigarette, anybody who smoked knows this. You smoke that first cigarette and you get high. All of a sudden you get dizzy. It's like a sensation, a big sensation. And here he's getting it from the juice. And it's like the constant conditions of working in that tobacco field. And that's what I wanted to show him. When I went in to take the pictures of the workers there, I got it myself, because I had smoked earlier, and I felt like I was just taking a big, huge hit off of a big cigarette. I'm just walking into the field there with the dizziness and the disorientation, and and I thought, well, boy, what is it like to work there every day and feel this? And so that's what the picture is trying to do. It's trying to get close so that you see the hands, and then if you know anything about what this work is like, you think about what it feels like. And then of course you also see on his shirt, you see the sweat. And of course, working in the tobacco field in the middle of the summer in North Carolina, it's 100 degrees. And so it's hot.
I also wanted to briefly talk about, you're talking about the labor and really getting close to the workers. And, it's one thing to drive by places in the Central Valley and, places like Fresno and Visalia up in Yuba City up north, and places like the Salinas Valley and, the 101 that goes right through the valley of the Salinas Valley. And we're so far away from the farm workers, and we're so lucky, to have fruits and vegetables at an easy access. We're good at complaining about the shape sometimes and the color, but we never really step on agricultural fields anymore. And if you've stepped on a field of lettuce or broccoli, cauliflower, and you just kind of take a deep breath, it can be somewhat toxic out there. Not every field is organic, right? So there's still a lot of pesticides that are used out there. But one of the things that also strikes me about looking at the work up close, I mean, and really getting next to the person, is the speed of the work and the kind of endurance that you need to do the work. And agricultural work, farm worker labor has been categorized as unskilled for many decades. And what stands out about your photographs, and as someone who comes from a family of farm workers, is you really capture the dignity of the work, but also really, like you talked about the worker in the previous screen, the sweat, the smell is almost palpable, right? I want to share a quote that David shared with me earlier for a separate project, but I really feel that this quote really captures a little bit about your experience, but also the experience of farm workers. And so David stated, quote, this is a question related to farm work and workers. David says, quote, "I want people who are looking at these photographs to understand what it feels like to do this work. Many of these jobs are physically very demanding. And so I want to show that what the physical requirement is of working. For instance, bent over. I tried picking strawberries myself and I lasted 2 weeks. That was it. I couldn't do it because I couldn't bend over and endure the pain all day, every day, and come back every morning for more." End of quote. And David, photographs like this one. This is a worker who's working in the cabbage fields. Well, can you talk a little bit about doing agricultural work and what it means to the body? I know there's an author who's titled his book quote, Broken Bodies, but what does it mean to do the work physically?
Well, it is very often, there are many different kinds of farm labor, but because a lot of it does involve harvesting fruits and vegetables, and in many cases, because the fruits and vegetables are growing close to the ground like the cabbages are here, the work involves bending over. And so if you go to Salinas, for instance, or other towns where there are a lot of people who have done this kind of work, one of the things that you see these older men usually walking around very stiff looking, with their backs very straight. And the reason is because they've had the vertebrae in their backs fused together, because after 20 or 25 years of bending over like this and working like this, the discs between your vertebrae deteriorate. And so you have to have the operation. So that's just one example of the kind of cost that it can have. Farm labor is also very often, especially for this kind of a job, paid for by the piece rate. In other words, you're not working so much money per hour. You're working at so much money per box of cabbages that you're harvesting. And that puts a lot of pressure on workers to not only work bent over, but to work very fast. So it's hard to show in a still photograph, and I've experimented with different ways of trying to communicate it, that these workers are actually almost running down the field, working very, very, very quickly. Because if they don't make enough money basically to support their families and to live on. And that sort of accentuates the difficulty involved in doing this job. In order to harvest a cabbage, you have to make some judgments about size, about what's ripe, about the quality of the cabbages that you are cutting. A worker who cannot make those judgments gets fired right away, because you're useless to the grower that you're working for if you're putting reject cabbages into those boxes. So, and then you have to trim off the leaves, the excess leaves off of the cabbage so that it looks, you said, Nacho, that we're very particular in the supermarket about what we buy. And boy, are we. a head of lettuce that doesn't have that head lettuce that doesn't have that nice round shape and has kind of the leaves going every which way off of the bottom of the head of lettuce will never get sold there. So the worker obviously has to trim off the excess leaves. And then of course, if you're harvesting lettuce and cabbage very early in the morning in the winter, the vegetables have ice inside the head. The water condenses inside the head. And if you grab the head of cabbage or the head of lettuce while the ice is still inside there, it will damage the vegetables and it will wilt long before it ever gets to the supermarket. So workers can only begin to work when the ice melts inside the head of lettuce or the head of cabbage. So all of these things are skills, are judgments. And so anybody that thinks that workers are unskilled, well, you ought to try working in one of these crews. Because you not only have to do the judgment, you have to work with the paint, and then you have to do it very, very quickly. So it's very skilled work, really, in a lot of ways. Different jobs require different skills. Going up those palm trees, workers have to go up 7 different times a year in order to perform different operations on those bunches of dates that are hanging from the palm tree in order to make them produce. So it's a combination of physically demanding, intellectually demanding. It's also farm workers work in crews. Like you can see the crew there. These are 2 guys in a crew. You can see the truck behind them with the loader on the truck that's going to load the boxes of cabbages onto the truck. So it has to be done. People have to work in cooperation with each other. So that takes a certain amount of skill too, social skills. If you cannot get along with your crew, you're going to be gone. So it's a very fascinating world also. I have to admit, when I became an organizer working for the union, it was really interesting to me to get to understand how workers worked. And then when I started doing the work that I do now, to be able to sort of document it in photographs. And so I go out to the fields and take pictures of workers doing this work. And it's, to be honest, I really enjoy it a great deal because, first of all, it's a chance to joke with the workers. People out in the fields, they are also trying to kind of like have a good time in a way. You could say, while they're working. So people will tell jokes, they'll yell at each other, listen to the radio. And so as a photographer and a writer, I kind of try and join in with what the workers are doing in the process of taking the pictures. And I think it sort of makes the pictures more interesting because everybody relaxes and we all do what we came there to do. And I came there to take the pictures of it and to show it. And so hopefully that's kind of what comes through there.
Well, it definitely comes through. And the other thing, I gave a talk yesterday and spoke briefly a little bit about my own personal, family and my background, my family's background as farm workers. And I'll never forget, this one time when my grandfather, on multiple occasions, had farm worker recruits, I guess they were recruits, go to his apartment in East Salinas in the Hebron Heights neighborhood. And they would show up before they ever stepped on a field, and he would take a lettuce or a piece of broccoli, and he would use his lettuce knife to demonstrate how to cut, how to trim, how to bag the piece of lettuce or broccoli, and then finally how to package. But each, whether it was cauliflower or broccoli or lettuce had a number on it from what I can remember. And, there was this education, this transfer of social capital that took, or knowledge capital that took place way before anyone stepped in a field. And the goal of this occurring was really like practicing for an interview or to practice going before an agriculture supervisor that would eventually, have say on whether you got that job, but you really had to demonstrate that you could do the work. And also your photographs, I feel, are somewhat different from a previous generation let's say Dorothy Lang and others who photographed farm workers, you really capture the intensity and the skills, but also well, really the kind of intensity that's taken place while someone is doing the work. But once again, this is work that not everyone can do, not everyone's going to last, and only certain workers are finally hired to do. Is that correct?
Yes, that is certainly correct. And you know, I remember one kind of joke about it. Again, thinking back to the workers climbing up those palm trees, the ladders up the palm trees. And yeah, it's kind of scary work, and you're way up there. And so the joke among workers that they would tell me when I was an organizer is they said, you know, only a Mexican is willing to do this work. Only a Mexican is brave enough to be able to do it. You know, they tried sending white people up those ladders. Nobody would, you know, do it. You know, you had to be a Mexican to do it. So I think that workers, they are looking at themselves all the time also about who they are and how they are doing that work. And there's this mixture, I think, of pride in the work that people do and its social value and its social utility, but also some anger about what the conditions are. Because clearly, as you can see in a lot of the photographs in this exhibit, these conditions cause physical damage to people. And they are also, you know, the piece rate thing just tells you, you know, that people are not really earning enough money to live on in a lot of cases. In fact, most cases, farm worker wages in the United States, the income of a farm worker family is between $17,000 and $20,000 a year. You know, Salinas is a lot cheaper to live in Los Altos, but it is not that much cheaper. So, you know, we're talking about economically very difficult conditions for people. And in the photographs, I also go to people's homes. I go out into the community and try and document on that. And part of it is documenting what is the cost of low wages, because the purpose of the photographs is also what I would call social solidarity. In other words, these photographs are not neutral. They're not intended to be neutral. They are intended to support the efforts of workers to try to survive under the conditions that they are working in. So, you know, this is a worker in a labor camp in Washington State. And, you know, his wife, when I talked to her, she talked about, you know, the problem of that the grower would give workers mattresses to sleep on that were, you know, had the springs coming out, and it would poke them at night, and that the roof leaked, and workers put up with these conditions because in the case of this family, they had come up from California up to the state of Washington to pick blueberries, and had to live in the labor camp while they were working, and then would go back to California where they lived during the rest of the year. So, you know, the purpose, and these photographs, this one in particular, was taken during a strike by those workers to form a union to try and change those conditions. So part of the purpose of taking the photographs is to support the workers in their effort to try to change those conditions, in this case by going on strike and forming a union. And I'm glad to say that they were successful in doing that, and that that particular farm conditions are a lot better now than they were at the time when the pictures were taken. And I hope that those photographs in some way played a role in helping to, you know, helping people outside, especially outside of that particular ranch, understand what was going on there and why, so that they could offer some support to those workers. So that was that's a in terms of why those photographs were taken. That's kind of what part of the purpose is. And it's also, you know, as a photographer, I don't work by myself. I work in cooperation with the workers and the organizations that the workers set up in order to sort of change their reality. In this case, up in Washington State, the new union is called Familias Unidas por la Justicia, And there was another organization called Community to Community that was helping, the workers to organize. Here in California, many of these photographs were taken in cooperation with California Rural Legal Assistance, which is the legal aid organization for people in rural California, especially farm workers. And so the community workers for CRLA would take me to places and introduce me to workers. Like, that's how I took this picture of this woman who is living on a hillside in San Diego. The community worker for Mario Vasquez, who is the community worker for CRLA in San Diego and Vista, took me out there and introduced me to the workers. And that's also why it's possible for me as a white photographer, and this is a Mixteco woman who doesn't speak Spanish. She didn't speak Spanish, she spoke Mixteco, and which is the indigenous language for people in that part of Oaxaca where she came from. And so Mario would translate into Mixteco for me, and also kind of, in a way, help her to trust me so that I would be able to take the picture and talk to her. And so the pictures are taken in cooperation. And the purpose, again, of taking this photograph here is to help CRLA, California Rural Legal Assistance, in its work of trying to, make sure at least the growers were obeying the law in terms of how they treated workers. And the other organization that I work with in California is called the Frente Indígena de Organizaciones Binacionales, which is an organization of people who have come from indigenous communities, mostly in Oaxaca, and that has chapters in Mexico, but also has chapters here. And so it's a very politically active group of workers and group of people. And so, the photographs are also trying to show what life is like as an indigenous person living in California. And so the photographs try and show the complexity of life. They're not all about being poor, for instance, or how hard the work is. They're photographs of, for instance, the dance festivals called the Guelaguetzas that are put on by indigenous communities here in California and elsewhere that show the the culture, the beautiful culture that people have as immigrants here. So it's trying to kind of like present a complex look at life of farm workers, life of migrants, life of indigenous people, life of working people. And of course, I consider myself a working person. So it's, sort of me as a worker and my kind of the work that I do, trying to relate as a worker to other groups of workers who are out there.
Well, and you bring up a very important civil rights organization that was really founded by, I would contend, social justice advocates, civil rights advocates in CRLA. A lot of people don't know the work that CRLA does, but they've been around for over 50 years from now. Founded, I believe, in the mid-1960s, again, from attorneys, fresh out of law school, I believe, who were really had participated, right, in the civil rights period earlier, and had advocated for civil rights for a number of different people, but also allies, right? And can you touch a little bit about the work that CRLA has done and how, because you've worked in collaboration on different exhibits with CRLA?
That's right. And CRLA was a product of the civil rights movement. I would say the Chicano civil rights movement of the 1960s, and especially of the farm workers movement, but also it drew on the incredible histories and talents of people in the Latino and Chicano community. Ralph Abascal, who was the first director of CRLA, his uncle had been a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, the war against fascism in Spain in the 1930s. So people came into the 60s and came into the civil rights movement and the farm workers movement already with a set of politics that had been formed in the struggles of previous generations of working people. But as you say, Nacho, the people who founded it, it came out of the upsurge of farm worker organizing, the great strike in Delano, and the strikes that came before it by the Filipinos and the Manongs and the labor camps in California, and then the strikes of braceros in the Imperial Valley in the early 1960s, and the strikes of farm workers, of Mexican and Latino farm workers, the Community Service Organization, another organization, Corona, and the Movement for Civil Rights in the cities as well. All of this produced this upsurge. And so young people like Jose Padilla, who is the current director of the California Rural Legal Assistance, who went to Stanford as a student, he kind of got politicized as a high school student in the Imperial Valley in Brawley, and then went to Stanford and became part of the Chicano civil rights student movement in Stanford. And of course, when he went to law school, what was Jose's idea of what the purpose of going to law school was? It was to be able to return to the community and to use the legal skills that he had acquired in law school to help advance the movement of rural people. And of course, what we're talking about when we talk about rural people in California, we're talking about migrants from Mexico especially, but from other countries as well, farm workers, poor people, people who in our society are struggling for power to try to change their lives. And so CRLA's legal purpose is, it's not just an abstract enforcement of the law, which of course it is. These are attorneys, so they go to court and they have legal cases to enforce the law, but to enforce the law as it protects and helps to advance the interests of working people. And so that's what CRLA is. And so of course, when I started trying to think about how am I going to document the conditions of working people, one of the first organizations I thought about was CRLA. And it's been a very, very important partnership with the attorneys and especially the community workers. In a CRLA office, and CRLA has, I think, 20 some odd offices around California, you have attorneys who go to court and present the legal cases, but you also have the community workers who go out into the community and talk to people about their rights. And then people say, well, okay, I think something happened to me that's not quite legal or not quite what it should be. And those community workers then go back to the office and talk with the attorneys, and that's where the cases come from. And those are the people that I work with. So they take me out to help document these conditions and these communities and the people that they know. And so I kind of work as a photographer and a writer. I write about the cases, and then this is something that hopefully I would hope is of use to CRLA and the work that it does.
Well, definitely. I don't know if you could see the photograph of the workers. Am I sharing that, Amy?
Oh, yes, you are, definitely.
The photograph, this photograph, full disclosure, is not part of David's collection. And I don't know who actually took this photograph, but it is part of the Ernesto Galarza collection at Stanford. And the workers here are using the infamous short handle hoe that was literally breaking bodies. This kind of work where they're thinning, whether it's lettuce or another field of broccoli, workers are bent over like this for, long periods over a course of a day. And CRLA, this was one of actually their first legal cases, and they worked in collaboration, I believe, with the United Farm Workers and the Mexican American Legal and Education Fund. But they eventually got passed the law in California where this tool would get banned.
That's right. That's right. And, by the time I started taking pictures, thank God, the short handle hoe was no longer in California fields. This is really more from the time when I worked as an organizer, because they had just recently gotten the court decisions and the law that led to banning the short-handled hoe. But working as an organizer, you could still go out and see crews where the foreman would pass out the short-handled hoe, and we would have to come along and say, hey, no, that's against the law. You can't do that anymore. it was also a reason why workers organized the union, I think, because it wasn't just legal cases. It was legal cases were very important, and the law was very important. But if it had not been for the union, we would still have the hoe out there, the short-handled hoe out there, because workers organized themselves in order to be able to change these conditions. And again, you think about those folks in Salinas with their, vertebrae fused in their back. A lot of it was also from working bent over with that hoe. So people tried to change that, and the legal cases in CRLA was part of it, and so was organizing the union.
I want to do just a quick time check. Amy, are we 10 minutes away from, or how are we doing on time?
Yeah, we're doing well. We've got about 15 minutes.
Okay. I also wanted to ask you, David, that the demographics of farm workers has changed over the last 20 years. And you mentioned a little bit that, you've interviewed farm workers in places like the Salinas Valley who are coming from Mexico, but do not speak Spanish. They speak an indigenous language, Triqui, Mixteco. But one of the other fascinating parts of your work over the many years is that you not only go to the Salinas Valley or the Central Valley or down in Southern California to photograph workers, but you really follow their migration. You go to Oaxaca, you go to the southern parts of Mexico, you've been to Baja, you follow their migration into the US-Mexico border. You've studied the conditions at the US-Mexico border, what it's like to actually cross the border. And so can you talk about just the demographic shift that's taking place in the fields?
Sure. The workforce in farm labor in California and the Southwest has been made up of over a century of waves of people, almost all of them people coming from other countries to work in the fields here and to make up the labor force here, because growers need workers in order to get the work done here. And there was only one brief period of time during the late 1930s when a substantial number of white people worked in the fields, which is the era of the Grapes of Wrath. That's what Steinbeck wrote the book about, and that's, that was that period of time. But before that, the workforce in the fields in California was made up of, well, first, the first people to come here to work were Chinese, and then the next wave was people from Japan, and Mexicans came after the revolution, and then in the 20s and 30s, Filipinos came from the Philippines, which was a colony of the US at the time. And then after World War II, again, Filipinos were a big part of the workforce here. And the story of Filipinos I found very moving. When I worked for the farm workers, I met some of those folks that had come over, the men who had come over in the 20s and 30s, who were very old by the time I knew them, but who, because of our anti-miscegenation laws in the United States and the kind of unfair immigration laws, women from the Philippines were never able to come during that period. And so a whole generation of men were single men who worked in the fields in California for all their lives, living in labor camps. So, that was a very important experience. But since, I would say the mid-1970s, the overwhelming bulk of workers in the fields in California have come from, and all along the West Coast, have come from Mexico. And then from the mid-1980s, there was a very important shift in the demographics of migration. When I worked as an organizer for the union in the 70s, most farm workers came from central Mexico and were mestizo people who were a mixture of Spanish the Spanish colonizers and the indigenous people of Mexico. But from the 80s onwards, the big waves of migration coming into California fields were coming from southern Mexico and coming from areas where people have been living in towns where people were speaking the languages that you mentioned, Mixteco, Triqui, Zapoteco, Chatino, other languages that were very old. These were languages that were 1,000 years old before Christopher Columbus ever got here. So people have a very rich indigenous culture that they are bringing with them, which is where the dances of the Guelaguetza are coming from, is from this culture. But it has also posed very important problems for people because many of them, like the women that we saw living on the hillside, don't speak Spanish and are coming as migrants into a very different situation from the small town that she lived in Oaxaca. It's very, very difficult at the beginning for people to understand what their rights are as workers, for instance, because the explanations are all in English, or maybe they're in Spanish, but for a long time they weren't in Mixteco and they weren't in Triqui. In fact, one of the important jobs of the Frente Indígena has been to try to take this worker rights knowledge that workers have had in the fields in California and make it accessible to this new wave of migrants and the language and the culture that people are speaking. So that's one of the things that I'm trying to document also with this project, is this transformation in the demographics. And it's very interesting because nobody comes to this country as a blank slate. People are coming with the knowledge and the traditions of the communities that they come from. And sometimes that's also a very positive thing, because in the case, for instance, of those workers in Washington State that organized that union in the berry fields of Sakuma Farms, one of the reasons why people were able to get together and form their union to go out on strike in such a strong way was because they already had traditions of collective action. And they were also people coming from, in many cases, even the same towns. And so there were all these networks that already existed among people based on where people were coming from and their migrant experience and their shared language and their shared culture. And that was kind of like, you could almost think of it as being a glue that held communities together, so that even when they faced low wages or the conditions that they faced here, and then the reality of having to go out on strike and organize a union, that really helped people. It was a source of enormous strength. So, this kind of wave of migration has been something that has had very interesting and sort of complex aspects to it.
And we always talk about the Bracero program as something, a labor agreement that occurred between 1942 and 1964, but your photographs are also documenting basically a new Bracero program, an H-2A guest worker agreement between the US, Mexico, and even, I believe, Central American countries, where you have a new wave of guest workers that are coming here legally, but also don't have the same protections.
That's right. And, it is like the Bracero program in that it is placing workers, it is a program where workers' visa, their ability to stay in the United States, is dependent on their job and dependent on staying on the good side of their employer. You lose your job, you have to leave the country. In fact, you have to leave the country anyway after the harvest is over. So it makes people very vulnerable. And the consequences of that can be pretty drastic. I was just covering a story, for instance, about guest workers in Washington State living in barracks where people are sleeping 4 to a room in bunk beds. And so during the current coronavirus crisis, that can be very dangerous. And in fact, they've discovered now these clusters of workers, these H-2A workers living in these barracks who now have the virus. They found a set of barracks where there are about 60 people who have gotten sick now as a result of that. And that's because of the closeness. And the closeness exists because people are living in barracks, and the growers have built those barracks in order to save money in a way that sort of packs people close together. That's a problem for farm workers in general, because you go to work, you're in a bus or you're in a car with a bunch of other people very close together. You go home, sometimes your living situation puts you in very close proximity. So in a virus situation, that can be dangerous. But for farm workers who are on this visa program, it is especially dangerous. And also because it's difficult for workers to protest or to demand changes, because the consequences of that can be deportation. You lose your visa, you have to leave. And so I actually went to some of those barracks. I have photographs of the 4 bunk beds in a room and of the conditions that are there. So on the one hand, people do want to come to the United States to work because the wages here are higher than they are in Mexico. And so people have come with these hopes and these dreams that people are going to be able to do work, make money, and take it back home and have a better life because of that, and then encounter a lot of problems that people had not anticipated. Health being one of them, wage theft being another. You know, whenever you have a vulnerable population of people like this, it's an invitation to cheating, for instance, that people don't get paid what they're promised, or that the conditions aren't as good as they're promised. And sometimes that can be very minor cheating, but sometimes it can be one, cheating that leads to people actually dying. I have been taking photographs in the marches that have been protesting the death of a worker in northern Washington state who died in a field as a result of his getting sick there and being forced to go back to work even when he was sick, and then collapsing and dying. And then the people who protested about it, the other H-2A workers who protested about it, were fired and then had to leave the country as a result. So it's important to look at the conditions that are established for workers in this country and try to ensure that people have an immigration status, for instance, that gives people some rights instead of treating people simply as a source of labor to be exploited. And unfortunately, we do have that history in this country in the Bracero program, as you pointed out, Nacho, from 1942 to 1964. And in some ways, I sometimes feel like we're going to the past. We're going back to the past in the way this other program looks so similar to the old Bracero program, and it's expanding so fast. Last year was 250,000 people who came here as part of that program.
Wow. Well, David, thank you. I'm gonna stop now and see if we have any questions. Amy, is this about the right time?
Yeah, this is great. And we do have some questions lined up. So yeah, thank you both. It was a great talk. First question that we have is from Nikhil. She asks, has David been using his experience and talent to document the recent protests or local community response this week?
Yes, in fact, I'm glad you asked that question. I mean, I had the honor and privilege of taking photographs on Sunday in Oakland, in the Port of Oakland, where we had a protest of the murder of George Floyd that brought out over 2,000 cars in a car caravan. I have never seen anything like it. It was just enormous. And each car, despite our sheltering in place and social distancing, I was taking photographs of people in cars holding their signs. And, I could see in the cars were, 3, 4, 5 people even. And so I thought, hopefully they were all from the same family or living together. But what really I came away from that with was that, first of all, that the anger in our communities, of course we can see that in just reading the newspaper and watching TV, the anger over the police murder of Black people in this country has gotten to the point where people are just not going to put up with it anymore. And it's surfacing in all kinds of ways all around the country, in some ways that I think were very positive, like we had in Oakland, in some ways that perhaps are more confrontational. But it is surfacing, whether we like it or not. And that's something that we ought to remember from the 60s, after Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, what happened to our cities here? Dr. King himself said during the Vietnam War, he said that the bombs we were dropping on Vietnam are exploding in American cities. And I have never forgotten that quote, because what it really is saying is that the consequences of the injustices of our society, including the wars, they cannot be contained. They will explode, and they are exploding right now. And so as a photographer, and I mean, I'm an older person, so I have to be kind of careful, and I have to be careful what I bring home to my wife, who's the same age as I am, the daughter of farm workers, Filipino farm workers. So, I have to be kind of careful and conscious about things like social distancing and so forth. But that's also why I was so happy to go to this car caravan, this enormous car caravan, because it made me feel that, that our movement, we are finding creative answers to the dilemmas that we are faced with. And one of them, of course, being that for many people, it is hard to have the traditional ways that we would respond of having, say 100,000 people in a march in downtown San Francisco. So instead, people have taken this idea of the car caravan, and they have turned that into a mass demonstration of people. And I have that. In fact, people want to see the pictures, they can Google me and my name, and it's on Flickr. Google my name and Flickr, and I think you'll probably come up with the pictures from it. So I think that we are very creative people. And, that to me was an example of the creative way in which we are responding to the injustices of our society in a way that is kind of like bringing us together. And that's what I was interested in taking the photographs of, was the commitment of the people who were in those cars in that caravan, but also the size of it. Just the, I don't know if you have ever been to the Port of Oakland, but it's an enormous place. It goes on for about 5 or 6 miles. And there were 3 lines of cars going in each direction, bumper to bumper. It's just, they say it was 2,000 cars. I have no idea how you count these things. It seemed to me like there could have even easily been more than that. But I also admire the other photographers who are out there, who are documenting the other forms in which this protest is taking place. I have a very good friend, Brooke Anderson, who is out there with her camera. She was just out there on Monday documenting the march of high school students out of Oakland Technical High School, where I went to high school. There were 10,000 young people, high school age students that marched from Oakland Technical High School down to downtown Oakland as a result of it. And I think when you get 10,000 high school students out there, you have to acknowledge that something is going on here. People are angry and they want justice. And I admire Brooke for being out there with a camera and taking the risk to her health and to the health of people around here with her dedication to that. And I know that there are other photographers and reporters out there doing that. And I say, my hats are off to you.
Okay. Thank you. Well, we actually do have some questions that are pretty specific to, speaking of photography and cameras. So we have a question from Gary Hedden. What camera do you use? And another one from Jacques Rupp. What about lens selections? You look like you get really tight, which makes for such powerful images. Do you keep equipment simple? Lighting, natural?
Yes, natural lighting. Sometimes you have to use a flash if you're indoors and you want to take a picture because it's so dark. But even indoors, I try to use natural light where I can, because it produces a photograph that, to me, looks like more like the reality. Of course, I do take them in black and white, which is not exactly reality, because what it does is it takes out the color. And I do that because it helps, I think, for us to feel an impact. It simplifies things in some ways, and it has an impact that is, in some ways, to me, more dramatic. I've been taking photographs from the film days. So, when I started taking photographs in the 1980s, I used Contax cameras, which were made in Germany, a very high quality camera. And the reason why I used them was because they had Zeiss lenses, and Zeiss lenses were at the time the best lenses in the world. And they cost me money, so I had to save up my pennies and buy the equipment, but I did. Then when we made the transition from film to digital, I began using Canon cameras, and I use a Canon 5D. I have a couple of Canon 5D bodies and a set of lenses for them. And my kind of go-to lens is our zoom lenses, because I'm taking pictures on the fly, I guess you would say. You know, you look at the pictures on the screen here, you know, I'm out in the field, I can't really easily change lenses very easily. And plus dirt, you know, you start changing lenses in the dirt in the field and the dust is going to get into the camera and cause all kinds of problems. So what I do is I use a zoom lens. It's my go-to lens. And the one I have, I use a Canon full frame camera with a 24-105 lens, and that's sort of like the standard one. And that enables me to get really pretty close with that wide angle lens, and you can still see enough of the background to give you context so that you know where you are. And at the same time, if I want to use a sort of like a mild telephoto to kind of pull in something, I have the lens there that's available for me to do it. So that's sort of like my basic equipment set here. I do kind of try and keep it simple because I'm kind of out there a lot of times out there running. And so I don't want to have too much weight, and I want to be able to concentrate on what I'm seeing rather than the equipment. So the equipment is, to me, is, I have this joke about, sometimes I teach classes for students about photography, and I keep reminding them, you know, the camera is just a stupid machine, really. It's up to you as a photographer. You have to control it. You have to tell it what to do. And a good photographer, I think, gets to the place where a lot of the interaction between you and the camera is not happening on a totally conscious level. You're just doing it. And the conscious part of your mind is really more focused on what's in front of you, where you have to be in order to take the picture, what's going to be in it, how you're going to have to do it. So again, keeping it simple, I think, is the trick.
Great. We have a couple of related questions, and David, you did touch on this a little bit, but maybe you could dig in a little bit more into these questions. We have a question from Andrew. Have you noticed any progressive changes in California farm worker unions or associations since you participated in one? And a related question from Marsha Adams, do you feel conditions for migrant farm workers have declined in recent years?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a subject for books. In other words, they're very good questions. And there's a lot to them and a lot to answering them. So first of all, I think that that changes for farm workers here in California, let's talk about California specifically. Things are very, very different for farm workers today than they were in the 1950s and the early 1960s, before workers went on strike in Delano in the Big Grape Strike and the formation of the United Farm Workers Union. That empowered workers and empowered communities in very important ways. And part of it is just that simple thing that you referred to, Nacho, you know, the short-handled hoe. We don't have that in the fields anymore. We have bathrooms in the fields now. We didn't before. If you were a woman and you wanted to go to the bathroom in a field, before there were bath porta potties out there, well, other women would kind of surround you and everybody would hold up their coats, and that was your privacy. You know, that was humiliation, extreme humiliation for people. And that doesn't exist there. And and it's not because the union came in from outside and did something. It's because workers changed those conditions by organizing a union that forced growers to implement those changes. So that's very important. And that led to political changes. You know, everything from the formation of California Rural Legal Assistance, and now we have laws. We have an overtime law in California that says that farm workers get overtime just like other workers get after 8 hours in a day and 40 hours in a week. They don't have that in Oregon. They don't have that in Arizona. In fact, they don't have it in any other state except Hawaii. So that's political power. And that happened because over time in rural California, farm worker families sent their kids to school. People got educated, they got college degrees, they began running for office, and now we have a legislature in which we have a lot of legislators coming from farm worker families who know what it means to have overtime. and got that overtime law passed. And it took 15 years to do it, but we got it. And the same thing is about the law that we have in California that gives workers in California the right to form unions and a process for doing that. So organizing a union in the fields produced changes in schools. When the union, in the 1950s, if you were a Mexican kid, first of all, you went to school that could often be basically segregated. It was like we had segregation here, like in the South. We had movie theaters that said certain sections for Mexicans only, white people downstairs, Mexicans in the balcony. But also, if you spoke Spanish in school, in elementary school, your teacher would slap you on the wrist with a ruler. I know, I've talked to many workers who this happened to. That doesn't happen anymore. So I'm saying it produced these changes, but not everything changed. In fact, some things that changed are kind of moving backwards. We mentioned the Bracero program, that's H2A, that's moving backwards. But other things are moving backwards too. The wage level for workers, when the union was strongest at its peak in the late 1970s, early 1980s, well, the base level for workers was about 2.5 times the minimum wage. Well, today it is the minimum wage. If we had the same basic ratio of wages to the minimum wage for farm workers in California today, farm workers would be making $25 and $30 an hour. And of course, people are making very close to minimum wage. So that's fallen back. And the consequences of that can be very brutal. Housing. People who are making minimum wage cannot afford decent housing. People are, more than one family get together and share a house, for instance. That's, and then again, in the coronavirus crisis, that can be a health-threatening situation for people. So that's a product of this movement backwards. And I think it's also because in some ways, the union is not as strong today. Let's be frank about it. The farm workers union is not as strong today in California agriculture and among California farm workers as it was in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And we can talk a lot about what the reasons for that might be, but that is the fact. And so it's a sort of like a combination of things. You sort of some movement forward, some movement backwards. But farm workers like workers in general. And that's one thing I learned as a working class activist myself. And as we all try to change conditions for the better where we can. And so, workers go on strike in California still. They organize unions, they organize themselves into the Farm Workers Union. There are some pictures in the exhibit of workers organizing into the union at a blueberry ranch out near Delano in McFarland. And workers are organizing into unions in other places too, Washington State or Ohio or North Carolina. In fact, that's one of the things that the union did. It sort of sparked this movement around the country of farm workers in other places setting up unions too. So that's why I said it's complex and something to write books about, because you kind of have to see how and where people were able to move forward, and then also see what happened in the years afterwards as well too.
Ignacio, you've done a lot of research on this topic as well. Did you want to add to that?
No, I completely agree with David. I'm quite an optimist, and as a historian, I'm really thankful for all the work that David has done over the course of his career. I mean, I think today's generation is it's going to take some time, right? And everything that's occurring is a terrible tragedy, but it's like the author or scholar Mark Brilliant talks about with civil rights movements. They're long, but they're also wide, and they include a number of different ethnic groups that have been participating for decades, right? Throughout the 60s, it was obviously the civil rights movement led by people like Dr. King and others, and also the Black Power movement of that period that was very influential on other groups. And so you have a Chicano movement that was advocating for rights, but also a labor movement in the UFW. You have civil rights organizations like MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal and Education Fund, CRLA. You have other organizations, LULAC, who's been around for decades, that have been advocating for civil rights, labor rights, voting rights, we forget about, right? And I think that over the decades, the children of the civil rights leaders, have gone back to certain communities, have gone back to Salinas, have gone back to rural areas. And it's taken years. The children of farm workers are at the highest levels of American politics in Congress, in the state legislature. A good friend of mine, Luis Alejo, is a very powerful Monterey County supervisor. A mentor of mine, the Monterey County Supervisor Simone Salinas, but others, at the highest levels, are advocating at the forefront for better housing, better working conditions, better wages. And so if you study that long and wide labor and civil rights movement, I feel like there's been a lot of changes. Of course, you still have a number of employers out there that are still committing these terrible abuses. And David has much more experience because he's out in the field. He's going to Washington. He's traveling to Mexico. He covered a major strike in Mexico where, the conditions there were terrible. And so I totally agree that we've made a lot of progress. We've also made a lot of progress for legal farm workers, American citizens. Again, thanks to the advocacy of CRLA and MALDEF that got, for example, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that allowed, I believe, over 2 million immigrants, a lot of them farm workers, to become legal and have access to, to be able to vote, to allow their children to go to the best universities in the country, right, and to return. And so we have that, but again, we also have these terrible stories that David has covered.
Great, thank you. Well, one of the things that I don't think many of our attendees know is that you two have actually worked together quite extensively before this talk. And Ignacio, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about how Stanford acquired David's collection, and just a little bit more too about the role of museums and libraries and archives in collecting these types of stories, these types of collections, and what we need to do in order to collect these types of stories, preserve them, share them, what our role is as public institutions.
Well, that's a great question. I'm very lucky and thankful to work in the Department of Special Collections and University Archives. But my mentor there, and talking about, the young people that have come out of the civil rights movement, and especially specifically the Chicano movement. My mentor at Stanford, Roberto Trujillo, who's the director there, who hired me there, he was part of that Chicano movement. And so when he first got hired, he'll tell you the story better than I can. He'll let you know that he was one of few Latinos, Mexican Americans in the industry and the archival world and the library system. And the kinds of stories he's shared over having to advocate, right, for these collections, are in a sense their own kind of movement, if you will, because it takes that kind of advocacy, it takes that kind of movement. Stanford has been a great institution over the past number of decades in making sure that these collections are secure, are safe, but also accessible. The university has done an incredible job to make David's work, one of his colleagues who has passed away, Bob Fitch's work, available online. So you don't necessarily have to just go and visit the university. You can access the records of these civil rights organizations. I was talking about CRLA. The university acquired the papers of CRLA, the papers of MALDEF. There's a collection with regards to the United Farm Workers. The photography of David is going to help a number of researchers over the next decades write, papers there, dissertations, books about this history. But to answer your question, it's taken decades of advocacy by people like Roberto Trujillo and others there at Stanford, former other historians. Al Camarillo at one point was there, other advocates who have really fought for the space and had their own academic struggles. But the university has been very supportive. And I take pride in saying, not because of me, but because of others before me, like Roberto Trujillo, who I would argue that Stanford has become the premier research institution to study the conditions of and the history of Mexican and Mexican Americans over the course of the 20th century. If anyone is going to conduct research on the life of Mexican immigrants, Mexican Americans in the US, the first stop or one of the major stops is there at Stanford University. What can public institutions do, universities do, as all of this plays out? Is the first thing that comes to me is obviously advocacy, but making sure that we protect the history of what David and others have. We talk about people living on the margins of society. So these collections are lost a lot of the times. These activists, these stories, these oral histories, we need to record them. Braceros, who I study, are dying. They're in their 80s or they're getting older. So, and it's very important, again, for all of the different ethnic groups that we capture elders and their stories. But then, I think I want to be a little bit critical here and also say that there needs to be more hiring of, minority populations, people of color, and really, I applaud what Los Altos Museum is doing, and also incorporating the stories of different groups.
Thank you. So we have just about 2 more minutes here. And so David, if you could talk for 1 minute about what your next project is. Where do you go from here? What are you working on now?
Well, I think the next one is working on, I'm trying to pull together all the stuff I've done about the border over the last 30 years. And so we're going to have hopefully publish it and pull it together.
Great. That was a great 1 minute answer to that question. All right. Well, to those of you in attendance who asked questions, I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all of your questions, but if you would like, you're welcome to email me. My email address is ellison@losaltoshistory.org. And if you want to send me those questions, I might be able to get in touch with David and Ignacio and try to do a follow-up if they're willing to do that after the talk. So I apologize we didn't get to everybody, but David and Ignacio, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. Thanks to all of you who came out in attendance. We hope you enjoyed it. Again, please visit the online exhibits on our website. And we, on behalf of the museum, we look forward to when we can open our doors again and when it's safe to do so. And until then, just everybody please stay healthy, stay safe, take care of yourselves. And thanks again for coming out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.